Before we start, if you haven't booked a strategy call yet, and this season has been raising questions about your organization's actual psychosocial risk exposure, now's a good time. It's a focused, practical conversation about what you're managing and what you're not. The link is in the show notes. And I want to ask you something about your psychosocial safety strategy. And I'm using strategy loosely because we've established over the past few weeks that most organizations have a collection of initiatives rather than a strategy. But bear with me. When you think about the people in your organization who are most at risk of psychosocial harm, who comes to mind? If you're like most leaders, you're thinking about someone who is visibly struggling, someone who has raised a concern, maybe somebody in a high pressure role or a role with significant interpersonal conflict or a role with an unreasonable workload. Here's what I'd like you to add to that picture. The neurodivergent employee who has spent years developing workarounds for a workplace that's not designed for their brain and who's paying an invisible cost every single day to pass as neurotypical. And the woman in perimenopause who is managing significant physiological change in a workplace that doesn't acknowledge it exists, while her performance is being quietly addressed, while her performance is being quietly assessed against a baseline that was established before her hormones started to shift. These are not edge cases. These are two of the largest and most systematically underserved populations in the Australian workforce. And the psychosocial risk they carry is real, measurable, and almost entirely unmanaged. Today, we need to talk about both. Welcome back to Unapologetic Edge. I'm Philippa Scott. This episode is the one I get a lot of questions about because the two topics in it are ones that organizations are deeply uncomfortable discussing in a compliance context. Neurodivergence tends to get filed under diversity and inclusion. Perimenopause tends to get filed under personal health. Both framings are wrong. Both carry legal implications that most organizations have not worked through. And both represent a significant gap between the psychosocial risk that exists in most workplaces and the psychosocial risk that is being actively managed. Let's take them in turn. Let me start with a definition because the word neurodivergent covers a lot of territory and the territory matters. Neurodivergence refers to neurological development that differs from what is statistically typical. This includes ADHD, autism spectrum conditions, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and a range of other conditions. Conservative estimates suggest that between 15 and 20% of the population is neurodivergent in some way. In knowledge work environments and high-performing organizations, that figure is often higher. Many of these people are not diagnosed. Many who are diagnosed have not disclosed. And many who have disclosed have learned through experience that disclosure changes how they are perceived and managed in ways that are rarely helpful. So they mask. Masking is the process of suppressing natural neurodivergent behaviors and responses in order to appear neurotypical. It is exhausting, it is invisible, and it extracts a significant cognitive and physiological cost. Research on autistic adults specifically shows that sustained masking is associated with increased rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout. But the finding holds across neurodivergent populations more broadly. In a workplace context, masking is not a choice. It is a response to an environment that was designed by and for neurotypical people, in which neurotypical presentation is the implicit standard for professional behavior. That standard is a psychosocial hazard. Under the Australian Work Health Safety Framework, job demands that consistently exceed a worker's capacity are a hazard that organisations are required to manage. For a neurodivergent worker in a neurotypical designed environment, The cognitive load of masking is an additional job demand on top of the actual job. It is invisible in most performance management frameworks. It is almost never factored into workload assessments, and it contributes directly to the burnout rates that are disproportionately high in neurodivergent populations. So, what does managing this hazard look like? It doesn't look like requiring disclosure. It looks like designing work environments and processes that reduce the need for masking in the first place. Flexible communication channels, meeting structures that don't privilege extroversion, clear written briefs rather than purely verbal instructions, sensory environments that don't impose unnecessary load. These are not accommodations for the few. They are better designed for everyone. It also looks like training managers to recognize that neurodivergent employees may communicate distress differently. They may not self-advocate in ways that are legible to neurotypical managers and may need different check-in approaches to surface what's actually happening for them. This is not a diversity initiative. It is a psychosocial safety obligation. A workplace designed exclusively for neurotypical brains is not a safe workplace for a significant percentage of your workforce, and the legislation does not make exceptions for design norms. Now, let's talk about perimenopause. And I'm going to ask you to stay with me here, even if your instinct is that this belongs in a different conversation. Perimenopause is the hormonal transition that precedes menopause. It typically begins in the mid-40s, though it can start earlier, and it can last anywhere from 2 to 12 years. In Australia, approximately half the workforce will experience perimenopause at some point in their working life. The symptoms are not minor. They include disrupted sleep, cognitive changes that affect memory and concentration, mood changes that can include significant anxiety, physical symptoms including joint pain and fatigue, and in many cases, a substantial reduction in the capacity to perform at the level the person previously maintained. These are not personal health issues that happen to occur in workers. They are physiological changes that directly affect workplace performance, psychological safety, and the ability to manage the demands of a senior role. And most organizations are doing precisely nothing to manage them. Let me put that into a compliance frame. Under the WHS psychosocial hazard categories, job demands that exceed a worker's current capacity are a hazard. Poor support from supervisors is a hazard. Inadequate recognition, in this context, the failure to recognize that a high-performing employee's changed performance has a physiological cause rather than a motivational one, is a hazard. The woman in perimenopause who is managing cognitive fog while chairing an executive meeting, who is sleeping 4 hours a night because of night sweats and presenting as though she slept 8, who is being assessed on performance metrics that were set when her hormonal profile was fundamentally different. That woman is experiencing a cluster of psychosocial hazards that her organization is almost certainly not managing. And frequently, she is the most senior woman in the room. Perimenopause is a significant driver of women leaving senior roles in their late 40s and early 50s. This is sometimes framed as a choice, as women stepping back or prioritizing other things. In many cases, it is not a free choice. It is an outcome of a workplace that had no framework for supporting a normal physiological transition, and so the person carrying that transition made the only rational decision available to them. The business cost of that pattern in lost leadership capacity, in the pipeline implications for gender equality at senior levels, in the psychosocial risk to the individuals involved is significant and almost entirely unmeasured. So what does managing this hazard look like? Well, it starts with acknowledgement. Creating a workplace where perimenopause can be named, where a manager can say, I know this is a significant period. What do you need from us? And where the conversation is normalized rather than awkward. It looks like flexibility in how performance is assessed during the transition, not lowering standards, but recognizing that the same output may require different conditions or a different pace at different points. It looks like practical environmental adjustments, temperature control, flexible working arrangements, and the ability to manage meeting intensity during high symptom periods. And it looks like training for managers that include perimenopause as a psychosocial consideration, not as a women's health topic to be handled gently, but as a workforce performance variable to be managed intelligently. Now, these two populations, neurodivergent workers and women in perimenopause, are different in almost every way except one. Both are managing a gap between what's visible about their experience and what's actually happening. Both are paying a cost that the organisation does not see. And both are carrying psychosocial load that most organisations have not identified, assessed, or attempted to control. That is not a diversity problem. That is a risk management problem. The organisations that get ahead of this are not the ones that are the most committed to inclusion as a value. They are the ones that understand that unmanaged psychosocial risk in any population is a liability, that the liability is not reduced by the invisibility of the group, and that the cost of managing it proactively is significantly lower than the cost of the talent lost, the work cover exposure, and the reputational damage that follows from not managing it. Both populations are growing. The neurodivergent workforce is increasingly self-identified and less willing to mask indefinitely for organisations that provide nothing in return. The perimenopausal cohort is the largest it has ever been, and it is concentrated at senior levels where the loss is most acute. If your psychosocial safety strategy does not have implicit provisions for both, it has significant gaps. Next week is the final episode of this arc, and we're going to close with what nervous system informed leadership actually looks like in practice, not in theory. It's not a concept. This is a set of concrete daily leadership behaviours that produce a fundamentally different psychosocial environment for the people around you. Now, before you go, two things. If today's episode has surfaced a significant gap in how your organisation is managing either of these populations, a strategy call is where we get specific about what closing that gap looks like. The link is in the show notes. And the burnout audit is also in the show notes. If you are a neurodivergent leader or a leader in perimenopause or both, the 7 dimensions it measures are specifically relevant to the kind of load we've been discussing today. Free, it's 5 minutes. I'm Philippa Scott. This is Unapologetic Edge. I'll see you next week.